Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar from Infopro Learning, Microlearning, still beneficial or past its expiration date. Many of you probably know exactly why you're here, but just as a reminder, what we're going to be talking about today is this word microlearning, and not just the word, but the actual idea of creating learning in very small sections. It's been something that's really been discussed, I would say, for at least a decade now. Today, we're going to understand in the year 2022, what does this word really mean? Um, what have we learned about microlearning over the year? What are some of the challenges of creating it? And then is it still relevant today? And if so, what are some ways that you can implement it within your own company? So that is what we'll be talking about today. Before we get into the content, taking just 1 second to tell you a little bit about Infopro Learning, which is the company that's putting this webinar on. For those that have not heard of us before, we've been in this space for about over 25 years now. Our goal from the get-go is to do three things for you: to create meaningful learning experiences, a measurable performance impact, and a sustainable operational excellence. And we do this through a full suite of learning and development services. Our goal really is to be your one single source provider for anything that you need to unlock the potential of your workforce, of your people, I should say, whether that is your workforce, whether that is your partners, or whether that is your customers. One of the things we are very happy about is our awards. The only reason I bring that up is we just recently won 24 Brandon Hall Awards that were just announced last week. Super happy. Sheri worked on many of those, so congrats, Sheri, for all the awards that you and your team won. And with that, my shameless plug is over. I will pass you off to Sheri Weppel, who will be our host guiding us through this webinar for the rest of today. Over to you, Sheri.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nolan, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So to give you a little bit of an introduction to me, if you haven't attended one of my webinars before, I self-describe myself as a recovering art major. I actually started my education in art school. I was an art teacher for about 7 years, teaching 11 and 12-year-olds. So I spent my days full of, covered in paint and clay and working with all of those children. And while I was in that space, I wanted to explore what it was like to teach these same people when they're older. So I went into instructional design. Over the years, I've gone from instructional design to account management, and now I'm a client success leader, which basically means I want to ensure that our customers and our potential customers are satisfied in everything that they do with us and everything that they do, which includes some of this education components that we cover during those webinars. On a personal level, things that I enjoy doing are 5K races. My husband and I are actually currently embarking on a challenge to do a 5K in all 50 states. So I actually am just coming back from holiday. Today, we did one in Nebraska and one in South Dakota. So if you're from either of those two states, beautiful area. We thoroughly enjoyed visiting for the past week. I do have my coworker, Abby, who's currently asleep looking out the window. So I hope that she enjoys this webinar too. And I love to travel and I support a dog rescue. So this just gives you a little bit of an insight into who I am as we kind of go through some of this content. There is a chat component where you can't chat with one another, but you can chat with me. And there's going to be a couple of polls that instead of running them like regular polls, I'm going to encourage you to type inside of that chat window and share anything that you'd like to share with me to make this a little bit more of a dynamic session. So as we start to talk about what does microlearning look like, it really is trying to get information into bite-sized chunks that individuals can, quickly experience. They can get the knowledge that they need and be able to kind of immediately move forward. Like Nolan had said, this joined the fray about 10, 15 years ago and became a trend, and not just because it's more modern, but also because it's just a better way for people to learn. On the other hand, it hasn't always hit the mark. There's been, and we'll get into what some of the challenges are, but there's definitely been some challenges of the ability to kind of be overwhelmed at times with the amount of different modules that a learner needs to take to be able to complete an entire program. There may be a little bit of an overwhelming factor about how many different things need to be created. And there also maybe from a budgetary standpoint, you create a lot of different pieces of content that almost feel disposable. And so much like in, one of the things I actually discovered when I was in Minnesota this week as well, was an intent on recycling and on reuse and reducing waste. And it's something that we need to consider from a learning standpoint as well. That when you're creating a bigger program, you have a tendency to look very carefully as to how you're spending the budget. But when you're just creating these little micro learning topics, you can very quickly create content that maybe already exists. And we're going to get into a little bit of that in this session today. So before we begin, let's start to redefine what microlearning looks like. So this is the first time where I'm going to ask you a little bit of a question, and this is a real life poll based on a situation that happened to me. So let's say that you are completing your dinner meal and you've gone to do the dishes, and after you finish, you realize that the garbage disposal makes that noise that it's really not supposed to make, or no noise at all, and there's just water kind of piling up in the drain. It's after 8 p.m. at this time. So what is your next step? And I'm going to encourage you to type into the chat window how you would respond to this situation. But in a lot of scenarios, people have different options that they could take. They could, and this is exaggerated to make the point, but they could enroll in a plumbing certification course. There's definitely individuals out there who'd be frustrated by the fact that they can't fix this themselves. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to learn how to be a plumber, and I'm going to be able to solve the solution for me. There are those individuals who just want an immediate response, and so they're going to call a plumber and deal with any after-hour fees, but they're going to get their issue resolved right away. There's going to be those individuals who phone a friend, and they're just going to call somebody and see if they can have some help. Or they're going to be somebody who's just going to, email Siri or YouTube, and they're going to be able to get an answer and kind of sort it out themselves through these little nuggets of knowledge that are out there. And so really what this is it's an approach also to how people learn and how people solve for challenges inside of their organization. And so there's a lot of times in which an organization might choose to put together a big, intense course for their learners to be able to learn a specific job task or to learn a specific skill. There may be times in which an organization will just simply go and hire somebody to do whatever needs to be done and not really worry about upskilling their own individuals. There may be times in which you borrow materials from other parts of the organization, or there may be times where you just want to quickly learn how to do things yourself. So this just gives you an example of how people learn differently. As we go through and we're learning outside of a work environment, how do we typically learn? And so if I think about a lot of the individuals that I work with, we're either learning by asking Siri, we might be going out to Google, we might be going to YouTube. The younger generation might be FaceTiming or going on Snapchat or TikTok or something like that to be able to learn a hack on how to do something or the ability. And all of those components that we're finding on those different sites are considered microlearning. They may be less traditional, they may be less, have less finesse to them or less polish and shine to them as we might produce in a technical work environment. But that is still considered microlearning. And so if you look at the population as a whole, we still use microlearning every day. I will say that there are very different approaches to microlearning. I am one of those individuals who does not want to go to YouTube. I want to be able to read steps on Google because I have a very short attention span and I don't have time to wait for somebody to explain it to me on a video. And so I often use this as an example because we have a tendency to latch onto terms inside of learning and not really think about how things happen outside of learning and how we learn on a daily basis. So the definition is specifically, and I found this on a microlearning site on Google. It's really creating bite-sized learning, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, very focused and very specific to a point of need. And so the goal of this is that if the learner has a specific need or you've identified a need for the learner, you can either assign or the learner can come and get it. And in 3 to 5 minutes, they're going to get the answer to the question that they're looking for. So that's really the definition of what we're talking about when we talk about microlearning. But in this session, we're going to talk a lot about the what ifs. So what if the learner isn't in control of what they're going to learn? And so how do we as an organization give up that control to allow the learner to pick and choose what they learn instead of having a very prescribed program from us? And what if that's not possible? What if we do still need to control that a little bit? What if the learning needs to go in a specific order? So what if the learner has some prerequisite knowledge that they need to obtain before they go into that particular nugget that they've found? And what if the training is required? You know, we go into a lot of self-service, but there are still industries and there are still situations where you need somebody to be trained on a specific thing, you know, whether it be safety. You know, you're required for them to take some safety training to ensure that they're safe in their work environment for themselves, for others, for the organization. There may be other times where you need to make sure that they take training on how to use a particular system because the business impacts are too big not to. So this just gets us into some of the what ifs. So what if, when you think about microlearning, some of the what ifs that we need to consider that we're going to discuss today. So we're going to start with the benefits. And here's another little poll for us to think about. So let's give you an example of you attend a 1-week training inside of your organization, and not all the content is immediately applicable. And weeks later, you're trying to recall some of what was included. I'm sure we've all been in this, particularly if it's a new hire training. You know, you start that new hire training, it's the training that you take for the first week or so, and then you don't actually need a lot of that training potentially for another month or 6 months. You know, what do you do in that particular situation? Do you find that you go back to the learning content and the recordings to find an answer? You know, do you ask somebody else who was in the training? Do you go and ask your manager, or do you search for answers on the internet? And I will find that all too often what I find our new hires are doing is they're often just going and asking their manager. You know, there's going to be very few and far between where somebody goes back and goes and sits through an entire recorded session to be able to find the answer. They might go and ask a buddy if they have somebody who is kind of going through the system at the same time as them. We don't always have the benefits of having cohorts like that, but if they do, that might be an option that they may take. But a lot of times they're either going to ask their manager, which can be frustrating for both parties. One to you know, have the wherewithal to ask those questions of their manager and to be comfortable in that scenario as a new hire. And one, from a manager's perspective, it can get frustrating sometimes to be asked questions that you know were answered somewhere else. If there is a portal or something that a learner can go to be able to get answers to their questions and search for them, they will often opt for that as well. But that is very dependent upon that technology and how well you've tagged all your content that they can find it.
Well, yeah, Sheri, that was interesting that you say that, because I feel like the most, you know, common answer for me is I do the fourth one. I search on the intranet for less than 30 seconds and I don't find it. And so I say, I guess I don't need to know that. And I move on with my day. And, you know, for those that know, we have a learning management system, and I help sit on the future of that product. And that is the one thing that we said, if we want to do one thing really well, it's we want to nail down search. Because
Yes.
my generation, when they want an answer, you know, you said search intranet, you know, obviously at this point I would have already said, okay, I can't get this information on Google, so I got to search internally. That is the one thing that we said we want to prioritize, because as you mentioned, searching on the intranet is great, but it's only as good as your search function. So anyways, I was laughing at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, here's another funny anecdote from my trip this past week. So one of the things that we like to watch as a family is the Guy Fieri show, Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. We love to watch that show in the evenings. And so one of the things that we did on our trip around those 4 states was we would find places that he had been to. And my husband was very specific in that he wanted to eat the same thing that Guy ate when he was at that particular restaurant, which meant some very intensive YouTube searching, where I was specifically typing, what did Guy eat at Al's breakfast? Because I didn't have the patience to sit through the episode, which was available on YouTube that I could have found, but I just wanted somebody to answer that question. And so it's also in how you want to consume information and how readily available that is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So some of the benefits to microlearning for our learners is that it can be very focused and specific to the question the learner has and helps them get that fast answer. So for example, using that same analogy of looking up YouTube clips, there were 3 different ways in which I could get an answer to what guy ate at that particular restaurant. I could watch the entire 30-minute episode and perhaps scrub through it until the point in which he was at that particular place and watch that segment. There were times in which I loved that there were, 2 to 3 minute segment snippets that were taken out, that were put onto YouTube. So I could just get that isolated nugget. But my favorite was still where somebody had talked about that nugget on a web page and I could just pull it up and see the recipes that were there and be able to select off the menu. So again, a lot of that comes to how focused was that content. And yes, I understand that that's not learning from a corporate standpoint, but I think it is something that we can all readily adapt to, is how quickly can you get that answer? So making sure that your micro learning is still very focused and very specific. And a lot of that comes into the design of making sure that you're answering a specific question with what you're creating. A lot of people want to be able to have those short sessions. They want them to be available at any point in time. They don't want to have to wait for them to roll around again. So again, using that same analogy, I don't want to have to wait for that episode that guy was in Minnesota to roll around again. I want to be able to view it on demand whenever I want to get that information. And you also want it to be available anywhere. And we're going to get into some parameters around this. How good is the fact that we can have our learning available anywhere, anytime? But we do want, our learners do want to be able to access that content from their mobile device without having to go through necessarily complicated um, multi-factor authentications or anything like that. We want to make the access to information as easy as we possibly can. And so these are some of the benefits that learners get from microlearning. Now, some of the benefits that our organizations get is it's going to help provide remediation when the learners need it. So if you create those little microlearning nuggets and you have an individual who is challenged with a particular topic, or you have non-conformance to a process, you can just assign that little tiny microlearning, that 2 to 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, whatever it might be, to be able to help reinforce a behavior, to help recalibrate a process. It can be really beneficial to be able to give people on-demand training without having to say, okay, you're non-compliant in this particular process. In 3 weeks, I'm going to schedule you for the next session we have on time cards, and you can take that session at that point in time. It's better to be able to just simply email out a nugget saying, hey, here's the little micro learning on how to complete your time card accurately. If you have questions, let me know. So it really helps us be able to learn in the flow of work. It often does result in lower costs due to those short durations. And so because we're producing just tiny bits of content, we also can have a very quick speed to development. So we can quickly develop this content as opposed to developing these very large, robust programs. The other thing that microlearning affords you to, from a budgetary standpoint, is there's a little bit less expectation when it comes to microlearning. Because a lot of the YouTube things that we view online are, somebody in their kitchen showing you how to fix a garbage disposal just using their cell phone camera and no like professional voiceover. I think we've lessened our expectations of what microlearning needs to look like, which allows us to produce it more cost effectively and quicker, which is a great benefit to an organization as well. And again, to Nolan's point, as long as you have that search enabled and as long as you have things tagged properly, you do have the ability to reuse it in multiple programs across multiple audiences. And so the smaller the nugget that you create, the more the potential you have to be able to create something that you can use across multiple programs. So if you create, think about a lot of the programs that we produce as organizations. If you create a tiny little nugget that introduces a new employee to your organization, instead of creating that content across 10, 15 new hire programs, you'd be able to reuse that content across 10, 15 new hire programs. So it gives you a lot of different potential to create this experience that feels very personalized, but you're actually getting a lot of benefit for reuse. So again, we're going to get into some of those what ifs. So what if you create that nugget, but it doesn't really answer the question? Or what if it requires base knowledge that the learner just simply doesn't have? And to Nolan's point, what if the learner can't find it? So what if we create all of this knowledge and the learner doesn't have the ability to find it, or we haven't been successful in creating that search parameter to make it accessible for those learners? So these are just some of the other what ifs that we need to consider, which takes us right into the challenges section. So here's another little poll, another little thing for you to consider. So let's say that a learner has a question and goes out to the LMS to find an answer, struggles to find the answer to their specific question. What would you do next? So as a learner, would you continue to search by keywords until the course is found? Would you take a course that might answer the question, but actually might not, and you might wind up wasting some of your time? Would you just simply ask your manager, or would you search for answers on the internet? Or the internet for that matter. And I think that a lot of times we will try to continue to search by keywords. I know that that's typically my mode, is I'll keep trying different words until I get where I need to be. And the search parameters have definitely gotten much better. The search engines have definitely gotten much better to be able to find things. But a lot of it does have to do with, again, how you have tagged your content, how you have placed your content into the system that people are able to access it. I do think that there is a short attention span to doing searches, and that people do quickly become frustrated. So again, that access to content is going to be critical to that content being used. And so it's one of the parameters that I often recommend in microlearning is you do have the ability to measure that content and how frequently that content is accessed, how frequently that content is completed. And so making sure that it's a really good test to the system as to whether you created content that was relevant for the learner, whether the content was accessible to the learner, and doing some surveys to be able to see how your content is being accessed within your organization. So some of the challenges that exist for the learner is, again, it's difficult to find the exact content that they need unless you have done a really good job in tagging, you put a really good job in cataloging your information, and you've also done a really good job in the design to make sure that content is relevant and that you can clearly answer a specific question inside of that microlearning, and that you're not trying to jam like a bunch of different topics into the same little nugget. There are challenges where sometimes the learner doesn't have the required learning. This is where a feature kind of like I always call it like a Netflixy sort of feature, where like if you liked this, you would also like this. It's also where an LMS can come in really handy to be able to identify prerequisite knowledge that a learner might need to have in order to understand that content. What I would also recommend often in microlearning is just putting a simple screen up front that might say, have you viewed these 3 modules first, if that's something that's required, because that's something that's going to help them be able to better understand that content when they get there. And some of the other challenges for a learner is that sometimes they really do still want to talk to a human being. I know it's crazy. I know we feel like we're an entirely technology dependent organization and culture. But I think also the 2.5 years at home has really gotten us to the point where we're kind of aching for human contact. To be able to interact with people, to be able to ask questions of people. And so sometimes creating these digital programs does leave something where the learner does still want a manager, they do still want a buddy, they do still want a cohort. They do still want some element of human connection, since we don't often go to the water cooler anymore unless you are returning to office. We don't have the ability to ask questions in the flow of work. Sometimes it either has to be a Teams message that's answered, or it has to be a meeting that's scheduled. So I think making sure that we're making space for that is important as well. And then challenges to the organization, and I've touched on some of these as we go through here, but sometimes content's created and it's just a one-time use, and we have to be very specific in how we do that. And so there are still going to be times in which you're creating content which is one-time use, and that's okay, but then make sure that your budget is appropriate for that. And so we'll ask a lot of questions when we create microlearning about, what is the shelf life of this? What's the target audience? And when we know what the target audience is and we know what the shelf life is, we can better make sure that we're allocating the right solution to that particular challenge. The biggest challenge that we're facing, and that a lot of organizations I think are seeing since 2010 or so, is that this micro-learning trend has created a lot of content. It's created a lot of content that either is sitting and kind of wasting server space because nobody's accessing it anymore, but we don't have really a good change control program in place to be able to archive things. It might also result in there being thousands of different pieces of content that people have to search through to find the nugget, the particular golden nugget that they're looking for, which can make that search concept that much harder if there's just too much stuff there because there's all this older information that's just no longer valid. And also, even if it is still valid, it needs to be maintained. And each of those individual little nuggets needs to be maintained and refreshed frequently and made sure that they're continued to be accurate. The biggest challenge that I see is just because you can learn anywhere doesn't mean that you should. You know, just because I can view a nugget on the train, on the plane, while I'm waiting in the supermarket, doesn't mean that my mind is in a space where it wants to learn. And so that's one of the other challenges that I think we face with microlearning is making sure that our mind is in a space where it's ready to acquire that knowledge. I took a graduate program a couple of years ago. It was a certificate-based program, and it had an app that I was using and had all of these little microlearnings in it. And I found that at times I was just simply checking the box. You know, I wanted to get a check mark next to that particular piece of microlearning, and so I was just playing it, whether I was in the car, whether I was, waiting in line or what have you. And I found that when I did that, I didn't retain it. It's just not how I learned. There may be others who can, but it's just not how I learn. And so I think that that's something else that we need to think about is just because we can learn anywhere, anytime, doesn't mean that we should, and doesn't mean that we're going to learn best in those situations. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the secrets to microlearning. And so I don't want to be in a space in which we're just talking about the negatives. I don't want to be in a space in which we're just talking about, what the challenges might be. But I also don't want to be in a space where I'm like, yes, microlearning is fantastic. We should all do it. Let's keep going. There are definitely some secrets that we can help make microlearning be a little bit more successful. So one of the things that we can do is to create a learning path to help the learner navigate through the content. And what this means is it's basically the best of both worlds. So you can either create this in a very formal way in which you have on your learning management system all of the content kind of all linked together. Sometimes this is done in the learning experience platform instead. Where it really prescribes a beginning to end of how the learner is going to go through that content, what things they need to take in what order, and really gives them a very prescriptive way of acquiring whatever knowledge or whatever skills or behaviors you're looking to have them obtain. This can also be just a general guideline. It can be a very cool looking infographic that kind of talks them through what they need to take and when. It can be a variety of different solutions. It can be a simple job aid that kind of talks them through, but does still leave that learning open to them. You can also do it in a very adaptive way in which you have different pre-assessments that individuals might take, and that will prescribe what nuggets they get later. And so there's a range of different solutions that you can put in place for this. Now, that doesn't eliminate the desire to kind of self-serve. And so you're still going to have learners who kind of want to be in more of a self-service modality, where they don't want to be told what to learn and when. They want to have all of that learning available to them to be able to consume at any moment. That is one of the benefits, and one of the biggest benefits, I think, to microlearning is that you can provide the best of both worlds. You can provide a very structured environment in which the learners can, if you do have a learner who wants to be able to go through from A to Z and be able to, progress through a particular program, you can assemble all of those little nuggets together and put them together into a program for that learner. And then at the same point, those same assets, without doing anything else to them, can be tagged, can be, put into a space in which those learners can access them whenever they have a question. So we are actually currently in the middle of doing a program just like that, where the first time the program was created, it was about 14 hours worth of training. It was all online. Each of the training modules were about 30 to 60 minutes. What we have done is we've created, instead of there being, maybe 30 different modules, there's now approximately 150 different modules, but the modules are all super short. They're going to be able to be self-service, but they're also then created inside of this learner journey so that the learner has the ability to progress from beginning to end like they did in the more formal program. So there's a little bit more maintenance that goes to it, and I think that's one of the shocks that a lot of people come upon when they talk about microlearning is they expect that if they're going from a 14-hour program to microlearning, that it's going to wind up being 8 hours instead, and that's not always the case. You don't want to sacrifice all of that content, but it's just going to look and feel a little bit different. So I love this graphic because it shows the little tiny people as if they're progressing through this maze, but you also have each of those individual components that can be accessed as well. Now, one of the other things that you're going to want to be able to do in order to be successful is setting up a maintenance strategy. Really having and I think in the technical industries, this is where they do this really, really well because they have SOPs and different documentation where they have to do that, where they have change control logs and they have a management of change process. And it's something that in other industries we're not as familiar with. It's not something that we have to do. But when you're creating all of these different assets, it's important to have a management of change process that really flags all of the content to be reviewed in a bunch of different parameters. And so some of the first parameters you might review is usage. And so before you even get to looking at that particular content, if you notice that you have a module that hasn't been accessed in 6 months or 12 months, probably 12 months is best because there's some things that are seasonal, you may choose to archive that and not waste any additional server space storing it, not waste any additional maintenance space of reviewing the content to make sure that it's still accurate. It may have been only a one-time use thing. You may want to review the content and make sure that it's still accurate. Make sure that that content is still valid. Make sure that that system hasn't been upgraded and doesn't need to be changed. And you may also want to be able to review it to just see if it needs a refresh. Oftentimes we may create something 10 years ago, and while the content is still valid and while the information is still valid, if it looks dated, it's not going to resonate with those learners. So sometimes just simply sweeping through and refreshing the graphics, refreshing some of the animations or things that might be in it is important to be able to give it another breath of fresh air. Now, as you create all of this microlearning content, it's important to have this strategy up front. You need to set the maintenance strategy from the very beginning. And so there's things that you can do inside of your LMS potentially to have things flagged for when they need to be reviewed. To have things flagged with a particular expiration date to help you maintain that content. But what we see a lot of is no maintenance strategy at all. We see there just being more and more and more and more content, and it's just easier to tack on another server and add more space to be able to store more content than to actually have the due diligence to go through a maintenance strategy. As I said before, the challenge with doing that is, yes, that is easier. The challenge with doing that is that you may wind up having content that's inaccurate. You may wind up having content that's irrelevant. Or you may wind up having so much content that the learner can't find what they're looking for. Or they may find multiple microlearnings on the same topic and not be able to pick which is the best one for them. So this maintenance strategy is something that's super critical as well. And this is the point that Nolan was speaking about in the very beginning of metadata. Metadata is an incredibly important component for reuse. And it is probably one of the most, in my career, it is one of the most difficult things for people to do well. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's just time consuming. People just look at metadata as this time consuming thing and they don't necessarily see the immediate benefits to it. Number two, if there is no strategy to it, it's possible to create tags. And when you spell a tag wrong, or when you spell a tag differently, or you use different capitalization or something like that, It's not necessarily going to show up in that search the way that you intended it. So having predetermined tags for people to select from, like if you're ever on LinkedIn and you're doing a post, and it's going to give you like 5 or 6 suggestions for tags based on the words that you used in your post. Having a more intelligent system that helps you do that, to make sure that you're not creating unique tags, to make sure that you're not creating new tags, to make sure that you're not creating inaccurate tags. Making sure that people are diligent in doing that. And the best example I have from that is again from 10, 15 years ago, and a lot of people were looking into LCMSs. And it was definitely this way of building out content, and people were lured in by the ability to build their content directly native into the system and reuse it. But what we found is exactly what we're seeing with microlearning as well. Is yes, they were able to create content. They struggled a little bit with making it look the way that they wanted it to. But if they didn't have that metadata in there, they weren't able to find the content to reuse it. And so at the end of the day, you go into your LMS, you're looking for this microlearning. If it's not tagged appropriately, it doesn't come up in the search, you wind up recreating it again. And so being very careful in what your metadata strategy looks like, making sure that you have those tags set up for people to choose from, and making sure that it's a required field that people have to choose, is going to make sure that you're getting the best spend for your budget, to make sure that you are creating the least amount of content necessary to provide for your learners, and just really helps you kind of reduce, reuse, recycle the content that you have. And then the last piece is kind of bolted on to that metadata, is making sure that you invest in some sort of a digital asset management tool. That's on 2 different levels. So one is from a learner level of there being some sort of tool which can have that search capability. It might be an LXP, it might be an LMS, it might be some other tool out there where they're just able to kind of peruse content and be able to access that content. Making sure that you have a tool that makes that search part easy. Making that search part not just easy but successful is critical to the success of microlearning. The other piece of it is on the back end. So having a digital asset management tool that helps you maintain all of the source for all of that information. So as you create little tiny modules in Articulate, as you create little tiny videos, having a place in which you can store all of the source files to them, so that if you go through that maintenance strategy and you decide that something needs to be revised or something needs to be changed, you can easily, kind of link between the content that exists in your LMS or your LXP to the content that exists in your digital asset management tool, and be able to revise that. There's been a lot of situations over the years where we still have the finished, polished files, but we've lost the source files along the way. So making sure that you have, file naming conventions that you can easily find them, making sure that you have the metadata and the tags to be able to support finding them, but finding a storage place for all of that, the storyboards and the raw files to be able to make edits as you need to, is going to be critical as well. So I'm going to leave you with this thought, and it's really kind of the analogy that resonates the most with me, especially having just come off of a road trip, is microlearning is like the 100-calorie snack packs of the learning world. They're very targeted, they're very specific, they're great to grab and go, as long as you don't eat 10 in one sitting. So microlearning is great. It's great to be able to grab and go. It's great to be able to get people what they need when they need it. But then you also don't want to accumulate 10 microlearnings together and still be putting forth essentially that hour-long e-learning module that we've tried to stay away from. I don't think my math works on that, how many modules you would put together. But we don't want to do that to the learner. And so it really is a very specific strategy of figuring out what content you really do need to create, what modality it needs to be in, creating all of those isolated assets, and then putting them in together into a journey that's going to make sense, but having learning be a journey and not a specific event like it once was. so that they can take those pieces of content over the course of days and weeks and months instead of all at one shot the way that it used to be. Because it's the same as, little bits of meals throughout the day is probably a better choice unless you're intermittent fasting than having one huge meal in the middle of the day. Same kind of theory applies when it comes to learning, is tiny bits of learning spread out in the actual flow of work when the learner needs it, available to when the learner needs it, is going to be a really great success model for you in building out a learning strategy. So my definition is definitely not past its expiration date, but we've learned a lot along the way from where we once were maybe 10, 15 years ago to be able to do microlearning in a much more successful fashion, both for the learner, for our organization, and helping us prepare all of those learning nuggets for the future as well. So I know I ended a little bit early, but I do like to give people a little time back at the end of the session. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Nolan to see if we have any questions or if there's anything else that we want to cover today.
Thanks, Sheri. We did have had a little bit of an echo there. Still having that. I'm trying to see if I can get that off. Okay, seems to be good now. We did have one question. We had a couple come throughout, and I was able to answer those. Some of those I think are very interesting. One of them was, what is really, what is really micro? What is considered micro? And I was thinking back on that, and the idea of micro learning, I think 10 years ago, that was when we used to develop 1 hour e-learning sessions, which now seems almost insane to think that somebody would sit down for an entire hour and take one session in one long course, and then it became 30 minutes and now it's 15 minutes. So I was just kind of reflecting on the idea that as learner behaviors change, our definitions of these things change. So I thought that was really fascinating. And one thing in particular, Sheri, that I would like your insight on is text-based learning. The most micro form of learning that there is. How are you seeing that, if at all, used in micro learning strategies?
I definitely see that learning, text-based learning being something that is utilized within organizations and something that learners are really adapting to. Because I think, when you talk about, yes, we used to give them 1 hour e-learning modules, and then we're like, oh, that's terrible, we should do 30 minutes. And then we're like, oh, that's terrible too, we should do 15. For me, it's less of the actual seat time, and it's more about how specific we can be and how efficient we are with people's time. And so making sure that we're producing content that answers the question without a lot of fluff, without a lot of extra things, and without a lot of potential knowledge that maybe the learner doesn't want. And so that's why a couple of times in the session, I've been very specific about answering one question for microlearning. And that's, I think, what the new definition of microlearning is being specific to one core nugget of knowledge, and not how much can I cram into a 5-minute segment or a 7-minute segment or something like that. But that's where I think the text-based learning has become even more critical, because at this point, people just want an answer. And I go back to those Google searches that I was talking about. At this point, I don't necessarily need it to be a video. I don't need to see somebody showing me something. One of my most favorite things to search for is I'll often search. I don't use Photoshop as often as I used to, or Illustrator as often as I used to. And so, I'm not as familiar with how to, create a mask or create, some sort of technique in Illustrator. And it's one of my most frequently Googled things when I do find myself there. I don't want to watch a 5-minute video of somebody going through all the setup, opening the file, creating this. Like, I just want that tiny little explanation of the 5 steps I need to create a mask. And so having that be text-based is incredibly helpful to me. And I will actually spend more time personally searching for a text-based answer than I probably would have been able to get the question answered if I had just sat down and watched the video. But I just want that immediacy. And so I think that's what a lot of people from a learning standpoint are looking for now as well, is they don't want learning that wastes their time. and they want an immediacy of an answer. So if they can get that through some chat-based AI bot that they can use to be able to get answers to their questions, I think they're very content with that. As long as it has a quick exit to a real person in the event that they're not able to kind of get through the the um, the chat algorithm, or being able to just very quickly jump into, here's a one-page PDF, here's a video, here's this. Just being able to get the questions answered as quickly as they possibly can.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we should, a great time to end. If it's a webinar on micro learning, maybe we should end it 15 minutes early as a nod, respect to that. So thanks, Sheri, so much. For those that haven't attended one of Sheri's webinars before, or met Sheri for that matter, really encourage you to connect with her on LinkedIn. I'm gonna, quickly go out and get her LinkedIn profile and put that on there. She is just such a wealth of information. Encourage you to connect with her on LinkedIn. She's an open book. Have any questions on this topic, please do write to her. Of course, you're welcome if you have a project coming up and you're looking for some external help on creating microlearning, you're welcome to reach out to us as well. I'm going to drop that email ID in there. But thank you so much for joining today. Please be on the lookout for our other webinars if you found this valuable. I can guarantee we've got one coming up in the next 2 to 3 weeks that you would find valuable as well. So thank you, and thank you again, Sheri.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.